Good evening. On behalf of the City of Piedmont, I'm honored to welcome you. I'm Mayor Jen Cavenaugh, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to open tonight's gathering along with my colleagues, Vice Mayor Betsy Smagel-Anderson, Councilmember Connor McCarthy, Councilmember Jen Long, and Councilmember Tom Ramsey. We would like to extend our heartfelt appreciation to our partners at the Piedmont Unified School District for providing this very special venue, the Allen Harvey Theater. Thank you for joining us and choosing to step forward as we learn, explore, and grow in community together. While what brings us together is a collective desire to acknowledge a painful chapter in Piedmont's history, it's also important to recognize that this is a deeply personal story for the members of the Sidney and Irene Deering family. We are honored to have Deering family members with us tonight. In attendance, we have Jordana Hiltonero, a great-granddaughter of the Deerings, as well as Joseph, Margot, and Meryl DeShiel, who are also with us. Their grandmother was Sidney Deering's first cousin. The city appreciates the opportunity to collaborate with Jordana, Joseph, Margot, Meryl, Tiffany McCoy, and Robert Price on this important project. In 1924, Piedmont's first Black homeowners, Sidney and Irene Deering, were targeted and forced to leave their Wildwood Avenue home. Racism fueled the community, and government served as an instrument that forever changed the course of history. Following intense pressure from the community, Mr. Deering sold his home to the city and left Piedmont. 96 years later, the Piedmont City Council adopted a resolution unequivocally rejecting racism in all its forms and formally acknowledging, apologizing for, and condemning all racially motivated, discriminatory, or exclusionary aspects of the city's history. The resolution further committed to engaging in individual and collective work to understand bias and the historical role racism has played in Piedmont and the community at large, in order to better lead a city which is safe, welcoming, and an equitable place for all. At its May 16, 2022 City Council meeting, our council focused its attention on opportunities to memorialize the Sidney and Irene Deering family and their history at the Triangle Park on Wildwood Avenue. In June of 2022, a subcommittee of our Park Commission was established. This subcommittee subsequently engaged with the Deering family relatives and held a series of community stakeholder meetings. Through the process, the working group developed guiding principles for a future Deering family memorial. The guiding principles established and embraced by city leadership in April of 2023 are as follows. First, to honor both Sidney and Irene Deering. Second, to be visible from the street, not just from within the park. Third, to teach something about Sidney and Irene Deering's lives and accomplishments, not only about the tragedy. That is, to have fully acknowledge the complete history. And lastly, to employ local Black designers for its creation if there is to be physical art. This brings us to where we are today. After extensive consideration, the City of Piedmont is proud to announce the engagement of Hood Design Studio. We are thrilled to kick off the conceptual design phase for the project with the skills, creativity, and experience of a phenomenal team. Once you have a chance to hear from Walter Hood directly, you'll understand why. Walter J. Hood is an artist and multidisciplinary designer from Charlotte, North Carolina, globally recognized for his contributions in art, landscape, architecture, urbanism, and research. Founding Hood Design Studio in Oakland, California in 1992, he now leads as its creative director. His passion for landscape and urbanism emerges from its broad democratic scope, allowing experiences beyond architectural constraints. Infusing African American cultural arts into his philosophy, he established a unique voice, reshaping spaces to reflect contemporary needs without erasing their history. A professor at UC Berkeley and former Harvard educator, Walter penned Black Landscapes Matter, and has received accolades such as the 2019 MacArthur Fellowship, and the 2021 Architectural League's President's Medal Award. Without further delay, please join us for a presentation by artist and landscape designer Walter Hood discussing history, landscape, and memory.
Good evening, everyone. How's everyone tonight? Good? It's very strange for me to be not in Oakland. But we're close enough together that we're here. But it's a pleasure to be here tonight speaking with you and listening to the mayor give the introduction. I keep forgetting that our studio has been here for over 30 years, and it's really nice to come to a neighborhood and see familiar faces. Ken Katz, 25 years of Splash Pad. Saw a couple of my students. I saw some other colleagues. So we are a small community here in the Bay Area. And just because we have political lot lines that separate us, we're still one community. When this project came across our desk in the studio, our first reaction was, really? And, after reviewing a lot of the research, it piqued our interest because one of the things someone in the studio said was, I could never imagine something like this happening in the Bay Area. And then coming to the site with the committee and actually learning more and more, it begins to suggest that, like a lot of the work we've done in other places, America, we're really good at burying our past. We're really good at erasing sites, creating semiotics that tell a fiction only for certain groups of people. And in my work, in my teaching, this is something, landscape and memory and representation, and particularly recovering those lost voices, has been really at the apex of the practice. We've been here in the Bay Area since '92, and I really pride that being in one place long enough that we can gather moss and actually begin to kind of see changes over a long period of time, but to actually help work with those changes. Our ethos in the studio over time has really tried to champion this idea of justice, particularly in the environment, and more of how can we talk about an inclusive history by embracing difference. And we think of difference in the studio as something strange, right? We're not always thinking of congruency, but things that are more idiosyncratic are the things that interest us. Tonight, I want to talk a little bit about memory through this kind of lens of David Lowenthal and this notion of how we remember. And in my class, I teach these various sort of characterizations. One, the tangible, the collective, the irrecoverable, the ostensible, the altered, and the invented. All of these are ways in which we figure out how to live our lives, right? Because in certain places where I grew up in the South, the ostensible past is always visible. The altered and the invented is there to stay. Very rarely do we get this kind of collective where we all kind of talk and agree and want to present ourselves in unison. This image here is in the 70s in Charlotte, North Carolina. You can see these people in these bell bottoms, right? They're pretty awesome. But I was about to graduate middle school at this time, and I remember this piece by Pomodoro, the Grand Disco. And I remember when it went up, this Italian futurist placed this sculpture in the center of our town, and it was all about the future. It was non-representational, but it was like this abstraction about we could have this amazing future. A few years ago, I had a chance to return back to my hometown. This is in 2019, and I'm standing at a corner where the Grand Disco was, and then I look up and I see these 4 sculptures. And in the 90s, the city decided that they didn't know their past and that they had to bring an artist from New England to come to Charlotte to then give them an origin story. And if you look closely at it, there's a guy on the left panning for gold. I never knew about a gold rush when I grew up. This was a fraction of a moment in Charlotte where someone found a big gold nugget and there was a gold rush and it ended. Right? But in the 90s, I guess this was this amazing thing that someone had found. And then there's someone looking out. I have no idea what they're looking for. But the one that got me was the third one over to the right. And I'm like, wow, that's a brother up there with a hammer. I'm like, was North Carolina part of the Confederacy? And I really had to think about it because growing up, no one ever really talked about Dixie. And sure enough, we're part of Dixie. And sure enough, people owned slaves during this time. And the point I'm making is, when I look at these pieces, this is an ostensible past. Someone has gone back and literally choreographed this history. And now for the new Charlotteans who have moved in, like I think there's 1,000 people moving to Charlotte per day, they believe this history. Right? And so when I go back, I'm in an alien future. I don't know anything and none of my past is there. That's why the work that we do is really, really important. And I've tried to think about this through this tripartite way, which I'm going to show some work, that in this country, in a post-colonial sort of landscape, we're still dealing with these dualities. One, there's a double logic. I was just talking to someone earlier about, we just bought a building over on San Pablo Avenue. For some reason, this 1 mile stretch of San Pablo, it's okay for it to be poor and marginal. It has the highest percentage of nonprofits that are building subsidized buildings along a 1 mile stretch. There's very little market rate, but we're okay with that logic. I can then go over to Broadway and other streets and they look completely different. But we're okay keeping this one logic. We're okay having West Oakland look a certain way. We're okay having West Berkeley look a certain way, completely different than the East. But these logics are all around us. And these logics create a semiotic, which are a set of symbols, signs and symbols that we know. We go to a place and it's like no loitering, ads and all of these things. They tell us where we are. And certain places have outlawed the semiotic so that you don't have these signs and symbols that say we're not a healthy place. We're not a good place. But other places we allow that to happen. And lastly, which Du Bois wrote about almost 100 years ago, it's the people who have to live in these places that develop this double consciousness, that they're then looked at from this logic and this semiotic, and then therefore they have to act a certain way, whether it's through keeping them in order, through policing, whether it's through zoning, whether it's just through how we kind of look at just daily life. And this creates a complex setting, but this is the setting that we love. And we like to work in this place because there's so much work to be done. So I'm going to talk a little bit about projects and how we think of memory within those projects. This is Golden Gate Park. Most people wouldn't recognize it, but Golden Gate Park was a giant sand dune. And this is what it looks like today. When we were working on the new de Young Museum, I was getting constant people asking me, are you going to do a native garden? I'm like, yeah. Are you going to do a native garden? Yes. Are you going to do a native garden? Yes. Everything here is a fiction. Most of the plants that you see here were actually deeded over to the parks. But the bigger thing is the city had to learn, McLaren had to learn how to take a sand dune and turn it into a forest or a woodland. And they went to Europe because during the time, I think it was the Dutch, they were actually turning dune landscapes into wooded landscapes. So first you have to plant grass, then you plant perennials. And once all that takes, then you plant trees. Olmsted came over and was like, do not do the park, do a promenade on Van Ness. But today you can go to this landscape and it's highly fictitious. If you take water, pour it out on the ground, it'll just disappear because the sand is still there. Or at the Broad Museum, we lost 5 trees in this ancient grove that's been growing for 110 years. But in reality, we're on top of a tunnel and it's a fiction about LA. So if you go to the Broad Museum, you're not on terra firma, you're actually underneath the Bunker Hill Tunnel. On 7th Street in Oakland here, we were asked to do a streetscape, and instead of doing a streetscape, we put in large-scale infrastructure that came from the freeways that basically created this marginal place. So you can actually read a lot of these things from the BART or in your car. But this idea of taking the kind of materials that marginalizes a place, when we started to work on this, it was a critique in a certain way of normalizing places. That next to a freeway, people will plant a median of street trees as if the freeway is not there. But if there's a freeway there, you have to act against it. And again, these are the semiotics that we're okay with. Working with the community in this particular, this was a wonderful set of community meetings. There would be a group of Afrocentric brothers and sisters in the back going, Mr. Hood, we want our 5 M's. We want our 5 M's. And I had to ask them, what are the 5 M's? It was Martin, Mandela, Malcolm, Madam C.J. Walker, and Maya Angelou. And they wanted them to be over the street. And one day I'm going across the bridge to San Francisco, and I saw the 5 M's. And I saw them on the freeway structure that holds the signs. So this is a Caltrans sign structure that holds the signs that you see on the freeway. But the trusses make M's. And when you're on the street, those 5 M's speak to you daily. But the work in the studio is pretty broad. You know, we have museum projects, we have work in Jackson, Wyoming, Buffalo Solar Strand, Pittsburgh, Cooper Hewitt. Someone told me we probably have the highest percentage of museum landscapes by a landscape architect in the country, which I didn't know. But slowly over the last 25 years, we've built a portfolio of public work, and they're very diverse work, everything from the Clippers Arena for the new basketball team, you know, again, to Jackson, Wyoming, to our lovely Splash Pad Park, which is down the street. But this work is really about working in those places. But a lot of our work also has stemmed with dealing with tragedies or memories that have been erased. And I want to spend most of the time talking about those projects, because I think there might be some way in which we might think of this work here in Piedmont. This is a December 2nd memorial in San Bernardino. It was a project that came out of a massacre one morning where a couple came into a public county building and pretty much massacred everyone. And so in thinking about this, we were very interested in this idea of technology and safety, because watching the film and reading how the entire county came to the aid of these families. And we wanted to create what we're calling the curtain of courage, a place in which people could come and feel compelled that they're protected. It's located at a county building, and like most county buildings, it's pretty awful, as you can kind of see here. But I was taken by, this is where employees daily have to come to work. They're coming from a parking garage. But as you can kind of see, the light in Southern California is pretty amazing. And you're looking out at the San Bernardino Mountains. When you turn around, you have this amazing view of the mountains. And I thought, could we change this place, this awful place that's there now, and really make it a place in which people could come, one, to mourn, but to also celebrate. And so really thinking about a curtain and a piece of protection. We were also looking at VESP, nanotechnology. Could we actually develop a pattern that could manifest itself in this landscape? And then working with the families really wanted something like little chapels. They wanted that they could go and sit and be with their lost one. And then we worked with them to put found objects or very personal things inside each alcove, and no one else knows it's there but the families. And then they wanted their favorite color to also be incorporated. So they're almost like these small little chaplets that sit in the landscape. And then we just had the opening a year ago, I think to December. And these pieces, again, create this new light and vibrancy to this entry, but they also create a place in which people can find respite and memory. And the light from the day to the night changes as you move up and down this promenade. And then when it's occupied, it creates, again, this wrapping. And we work with the families to develop the color, all the scheme. There's 3 layers of material that create this shroud for each one. Another project that deals with memory is in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We started working with the Hill District or the Hill Community from a public art project that grew in just collecting images from a community that had been pretty much cleared out doing urban renewal. And about 16 contiguous blocks had been taken away for a new civic arena. And so our project was called Curtain Call, which was building on August Wilson's work, who did the 10 decades of plays that came out of his neighborhood. And the Curtain Call was a way to get the community to come back. And so we asked people to bring us images. And did they bring us images? And we're collecting them to put images in glass that will then be projected on these 30-foot tall curtains that will sit in this erased landscape. Some of the pictures are just pretty amazing. Sorry, her head is cut off. It's your screen. There's August Wilson on the left. We just refurbished his house. Denzel Washington actually fundraised. Evidently, actors go and to basically make the pilgrimage to August Wilson's house in the Hill. And so now there's a spot there, and our curtain will be 2 blocks from that. This is the old Crawford Grill. But by collecting images, we were able then to piece them together to tell this story of this place that had been erased. And then as we were doing that, we found that Teenie Harris was a photographer, a local African-American photographer, whose archives is at Carnegie Mellon, and we're able to access his archives as well. So we have over 5,000 images that we're going to use. Everything from those existing conditions to the new project. And here's our curtain on the right-hand side. This is as development is happening, there will be buildings where you see cars, but we sit at the top of this hill, turn left to the August Wilson house. But these will be, again, 30-foot tall curtains where glass is now, we're printing onto the glass to create this kaleidoscope of time and space as people are moving through this new landscape. And we wanted them to be big enough to almost feel like a building, right? That they literally would have that scale. And then people could come, either find your image, we can change the images out, but it becomes a way, again, of documenting a time and a place that has been completely taken away. And this notion of landscape and mixing through art very early in the project called for a landscape architect and an artist. And very early in the project, all the green is a rain garden. Basically, we're collecting the rain from the housing and cleaning it. And I'd always thought about what could be this connection between the rain garden and the culture. And it turns out that the Hill District was considered the rhythm and blues capital of the East, next to Chicago. Lena Horne, George Benson, there are all these amazing musicians from here. So when you come into each one of the rain gardens, it actually will trigger sound motion, and all rhythm and blues rain songs will come on. So as you're walking, looking, you might hear, I can't stand the rain through my window. But there's this kind of relationship between sound, visual, and then the flora. A few years ago, we were asked to participate in the Chicago Biennale, and it was being held at the library downtown. And I was sitting around thinking, like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I happened to be reading the newspaper at the time. And it was like, Obama Library kills all the trees in Jefferson and Washington Park. I was like, Jefferson, Washington, Obama. Why are they dogging Obama? He's like the other 2 dudes, right? So we then found the trees, cut them, and one tree is made from Jackson, one tree is made from Washington, and you can figure out who's Obama, right? And we charred the Obama one to make sure that people understood this was from the Obama Library. But again, this idea of having a conversation, right, in contemporary time, actually thinking about the past is something we do, whether it's exhibitions or whether it's temporary work or permanent work. But I find these are places where you don't hear a lot of commentary, and how can design work actually help us get through, right, some of these complex issues that we have. This past year, we were asked to participate in the Venice Biennale in Venice, and I had been working in South Carolina the last 15 years with the Gullah Geechee community, particularly this one, Phillips Community. And I taught 2 studios, one at Michigan, one at Berkeley, to help them fight road widening that's happening in North Charleston. And this past year, Phillips, which people are descended from the Mount Pleasant plantation, they were deeded over 1,000 acres of land doing Reconstruction. They now have become the first Gullah Geechee community to have historic status, which means they can't drive a road through their property. So as we were thinking about this, that's Richard Habersham on the right, I thought, well, maybe I should take Phillips to Venice. Right? That would be an awesome thing, right? Because this year, Leslie Loco from South Africa, African-American, an African architect, was the first to present, and she really wanted the work to be about the African diaspora, and more particularly how the African culture arts can influence architecture or urbanism. So we had worked with them, again, 15 years ago along Holbeck Creek. You can kind of see Phillips is this area down below, and that's what everybody likes up top, right? And that's what's happening. That parasite is actually eating everything in North Charleston. Phillips lives amongst the overgrown. And they talk about the landscape as a regenerative thing, that they only take away the landscape that they need, and they leave everything else. And elders call it the overgrown. So we took this idea and we presented it in Venice. And we went back in time and looked at early English colonial development within the wetlands of Charleston. And there's a very important map from 1857 that shows it's called Black Shoals, the book, but it shows how the English was trying to map this coastline that's constantly changing. And they only mapped it for their safety. And what they did, they created these fictitious maps so that the settlers who were outnumbered from the indigenous and the slaves could feel safe. And so they made the map feel like South Carolina was born. In actuality, if you probably went 500 yards in any direction, you would encounter, right, either slaves or indigenous. And we got really interested then in this way of mapping and thinking about the 2 places. Then going to Venice, understanding that Venice is actually created over time, I found that a Carpaccio painting that had Moors in it. And these Moors were enslaved people that were brought to Venice for the wealthy, and they were not vaporettos, but they actually were servants in their houses. But within the paintings, they were all mooring boats. I know this sounds highly conceptual, but taking the timeline of one and comparing it to the other, we ended up in the same place where in Venice, it's the local flora, the chestnut tree, that actually has allowed the city to stay above water. All the buildings are actually on top of chestnut logs, right? Wood is holding up Venice. And then when you see the Moors, they actually are using the chestnut. And the same thing here in Phillips, they're using the local wood to actually build their houses within the overgrown. And so we came up with this construction idea made from baskets, sweetgrass baskets in Charleston, and tried to relate that to an architecture that could manifest, that could be part of this regional and vernacular idea. And so through the overgrown, the actual collecting of material, you actually create an architecture that's alive. And so people are one-to-one in that environment. And then looking back across the wetland, completely different than the artificial houses on the other side with the golf course. And then that is displayed in Venice. And then we took the construction technique from the right-hand side and then employed that within the garden itself. And this is the Scarpa garden, which I never thought I'd be able to go into a Carlos Scarpa garden and make a piece. But this is the chestnut that's actually used in the lagoons that then become the new supports for the structure, along with the Carpaccio moors. And so this idea that we're trying to talk about, again, how landscape can imbue place, but also how people are part of that through their production, right? And again, in Venice, most of it's invisible, but if you bring it to light, it really changes. And for 5 months, we actually turned this courtyard into a wetland, which seems so appropriate in a place like Venice. A little closer back here to home, the Crying Stone St. Monica Tiers is a landmark project at the end of the Red Line that takes you all the way to 3rd Street Promenade. And this is a very simple project in which, looking at history, I was intrigued by who was St. Monica, and St. Monica was a patron saint of sobriety in the South, and she came and she wept for the soldiers who were drunk, and she made a garden, right? The saints are everywhere in LA, right? And so those sandstone mountains, those same sandstone edges were also called the Crying Rock by the natives there because that's where their ancestors were thrown over the hill. The piece when I did it was called St. Monica Tiers. When we were going into construction, this is local stone from Ojai. One of the elders from the Tonga tribe called me, and we had this conversation about the Crying Rock. We've changed the name. Now it has both names. And we were going to do a ritual to basically cut the ribbon for this, but the elder passed away during COVID. But I'm glad we had that conversation because she reached out and she wanted to tell me that she was glad that I had made a piece that she could have a conversation with, right? And so sometimes, unearthing and putting things out is not about the statement one makes, but it's like lending the hand for a conversation, right, to a certain degree. And I love this project because it's on a public sidewalk. And Santa Monica has major transient issues with people sleeping, but to see this on a public sidewalk really changes your perception of this place. We're currently working in Winston-Salem. And if you Warriors fans, Chris Paul, the new guy who's come to the Warriors now, this is his great-great-great-grandfather's project that is called Peter Oliver, and it's located in between Winston and Salem. And Peter Oliver was this enslaved man who comes to Salem very early, and he sees this community, this religious community south of Winston-Salem, and he sees that they're artisans. And in his mind, he's like, I'm going to get them to buy me. And so somehow within a period of maybe a decade ago, he finds his way back to Salem. He gets purchased. They then give him his freedom. He travels to Pennsylvania, gets a wife, and moves back and farms 3 acres and becomes an artist in this community and is buried in the cemetery locally. This history was buried. We worked on a project for the I-40 freeway, which cuts right through the middle of Winston-Salem. His farm would have been south of 150, exactly where the freeway is. Ironic, right? I mean, in this piece of land, all that infrastructure is on top of it. So working with the community and the historians here, we've then envisioned this new pavilion that talks about this history right at the edge of the freeway. It's a pavilion and a garden where the family can come and actually have family reunions, but it also talks about the split between Winston and Salem. There's a history wall that we've been working with the family to create this extended timeline of the family that can also extend into the future. And it's a place where you can come and walk out into the landscape and actually see those holdings spatially, right? So you come and you actually perched out and look out over the landscape. It's constructed of wood. Most of the buildings in Salem are constructed of wood, these beautiful details of wood. So we're taking that same aesthetic and bringing that forth. and then showcasing a lot of the arts that Peter Oliver probably would have participated with, the pottery and the small cane pipes that they would make. And then on certain days, the family can come. This is a public landscape, but the family could come and use it. Right now, they have bi-yearly family reunions. Still on the East Coast in Arlington, this is a place called Nauck, N-A-U-C-K. If you've ever been to D.C., this is south of Arlington Cemetery. Arlington Cemetery was the first home to the first freedmen and freed women after emancipation. It was the first freedmen's village that was run by the Freedmen's Bureau. Within Green Valley, when we were asked to work on the project, I was intrigued by this notion of freed as a prefix. Right? Most cultures who come to this country are not called freedmen and freed women. I think natives were called freed, and enslaved were called freed once they were freed. But you find this semiotic all over the place. You can find it in street signs, but you can also find it in the names of places. And I went into this wormhole of this language thing, and my client was the county, and they were like, I don't think the community is going to understand all this stuff, right? And immediately when I started talking with the community, they were like, wow, that's really interesting. I never thought about it that way. And going down to the place, this was the site. And it was a pretty marginal, landscape, had a sidewalk. And county had spent all this money on history, which I find, again, this notion of telling people in a marginal place, you telling them their history, right? And not doing anything else but just saying, this is what your history is, and okay, we're not going to do anything in this context. And so what we decided to do was zoom back out. On our first day there, we took a bus tour to find out what was Green Valley. And what was Green Valley was pretty much all of Arlington. And the community was pretty much articulating to us that they were just shrinking, and they were probably going to be the last group from that. The local AME church is right across the street from the late 19th century as well. This was just completed a year ago, but it's basically we tried to create the most verdant space through the regulations of the county, because the county is into all these sustainable measures, and we wanted to go overboard to a certain degree. But at the center of the whole thing, Mr. Robinson passed away. The park was then named after him. And at the top of this project is a sentinel that the community really wanted to make sure that people understood this notion that we were freed. We did not have freedom. We were freed. And that's something that the new gentry, that's a new condominium apartment, they look out every morning to a gilded sign that has all the different names of the community, Green Valley, Nauck, and then Adinka symbols, but it literally becomes this blazoned thing at the top of the hill that talks about the predicament that people have found themselves in. And it was interesting working on this project, which has occurred on other projects as well, where improvements that are done in places where there are no history of improvements, and this is what I mean by the double consciousness. We've had to set up programs because people think this is for someone else. And having the conversations, people are very skeptical. It's like, oh, you're spending all that money. It can't be for me. When we worked on Lafayette Square Park here in downtown 25, maybe even 30 years ago, it was the same thing. But we created a casual labor program so that people there could actually still be there. But we don't know how deep this goes in communities. When you're denied something and all of a sudden someone's giving you something, there's skepticism. And there's reason to be skeptical. And so we have a lot to do, but we find that having a lot of these improvements anchored through some validation of something, right? Whether it's a validation of the diaspora or a validation of a kind of a history really helps to make those spaces a little bit more particular and strange. These last two projects are fun. This is opening day for a project. You don't want this on opening day. But for this project, it was actually kind of good. This is Princeton. And we won a competition, I don't even know how long ago it was, to basically give a critique of Woodrow Wilson and, more importantly, the School of Public Policy on Princeton's campus. In 2018, I want to say, handful of black students go to the president's office, lock themselves in, and says, we want Woodrow Wilson's name off the school. Princeton, at that time, this is pre-George Floyd, right? This is pre-national movement. Princeton said, okay, we'll start a program and we'll look into these issues. And this is about the same time the kind of enslavement that you're beginning to see across. Brown, I think, had already done a project. Others had begun to look at their history. The competition, basically the trustees were like, here's $1 million, have a competition, have someone come up with a design for it, and we're done. Because this is what other campuses have done. I think at Brown, Martin Puryear did a beautiful bronze ball and chain, right? It's about that big. You come on campus, you see the ball and chain. We participated in slavery, and then you go on your merry way. But these projects have allowed people to deal with it and move on. Here, Princeton was a little different. Woodrow Wilson as a figure was a pretty daunting task to deal with. I knew very little about Woodrow Wilson other than he was a president and he was Southern. But getting to know more and more and working with the university, we had to figure out ways in which to make a project. And again, as a person of color, I chose Du Bois's words to actually think about this man, because I was thinking of if I turn this idea of a double conscious onto a privileged person who doesn't have that secondary consciousness, what might it be? And that was the question. If he had a conscious, how could I illustrate it, right, to a certain degree? Located in the central part of campus, up at the top. This is the school on the left. As we were working on the project, it occurred to us, his name is nowhere on the building. It doesn't exist. There's no sign, there's no entablature. You literally have to go inside the building. So it's interesting that people were impacted by this building, not by text or anything, but just the knowledge of what it is. So there was no semiotic other than the architecture of the building. But there's also the Cornell Rothschild's trees, the Fountain of Freedom by Fitzgerald. And as it turns out, this is like really the main square for the city of Princeton. On most days, skateboarders are out here, right? And so again, it's a very interesting and strange place. And this was our first design. We took a square, cut it along its diagonal, made one black and one white, and then rested the white onto the black, right? And then made it 60 feet, 61 feet tall, whatever his age was. And that was it. And I wish we had just stopped there. But of course, it's a piece that had to do more work. But once we took this to the competition, presented it, we ended up winning. And then we had to figure out content. We placed it, we took out 2 of the Cornell trees, placed it right in the space so it doesn't change the sociology per se. It's almost as if it just rises out of place. And then we wanted to think about his contemporaries and what his contemporaries were telling us. And while we were working on this project, we were having a similar conversation in this country. Oh, they'll listen. They'll get it right. He'll do it, blah, 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 blah. Nothing happens. And the same thing with Wilson, right? I think Susan is out there during the reign, during the war, begging him on women's suffrage. Du Bois is like, your power is limited. We know that, but the power of the people is unlimited. White people of this country once sewed slave pins. So there was all of this from his detractors, from Trotter to Du Bois to others. And then thinking of things about Wilson and how we could actually think about the things that he contributed to, and then the things that he took away. And most of this research was given us to working with the university, the Afro Studies Department, as well as public policy. And this is how the brief for the competition was written. Give us his good side and his bad side. Like, is it that even? And so the project, again, aligns itself with the Fountain of Freedom. You can kind of see it in the background. We couldn't make it 60 feet tall because of zoning, so we can only make it 39 feet. But this is the piece. It's made of stone glass, and it reflects its entire surroundings. On the outside are Wilson's unedited writings. So we literally just almost like photoshopped it on there. So we did not edit, we just listed his writings. And you can go up to it and read some of the epithets in white and in black. But at the center, this is where the squares flatten out, we have his detractors. So on one side, there's the words of his detractors that I showed you. So you can stand there and read everybody who's saying, you got to do the right thing, man. You got to do this. And then you turn around and they're in lenticular. There's images of each one of the detractors when they're young and when they're old. And then through the gap where I'm standing, it frames some of those existing monuments on the site. And this is opening day. People are out reading it. And the reflections, you go at night, everything's uplit. And it takes on just this very strange sort of site in the middle of Princeton. You see these black faces of Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells. And it really forces you to come up closer and try to understand what it is you're looking at. And so this went up 2020. By the summer of 2021, some of the students called me and were like, Mr. Hood, we love your piece, but we still want his name off the building. And I talked with them and I said, okay, in the spring, we'll have a big rally with, around the piece. The piece was called Double Consciousness. We'll have a rally and this piece could be the place. The summer happens, George Floyd happens, trustees go meet. One of the trustees who was vehemently opposed goes out and starts reading the piece. And I get an email from the director said, she goes out, she reads the piece, she comes back in and changed her vote. And so it's no longer the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Policy. It's just the School of Public Policy. And I say that story because there was a moment where the work was done and it was only doing work in one place. That was with the students and some of the people. And it hadn't reached this other place. But with time, it reached this other place and then caused this change. And at the time we were talking in the studio, was this going to be a temporary piece or a permanent piece? Right? Because the temporariness of it, if it made change, do you then take it away? It's still there on campus. It's this shiny datum to this time and place of this moment that happened. It has very little to do, I think, with Woodrow Wilson anymore, but this time and place because it made a change in this place. And when we unveiled it, that's what the FU was all about. They decided to have it on African American Homecoming weekend. It's like, really, guys? Way to set me up. And as we were working on the piece, we got into this very interesting conversation with the students, who the younger students did not want to use double consciousness as a term. And we talked a lot about why. And they didn't like the aspect that I was using a term associated with a person of color for a non-person of color, which I thought was interesting contemporarily. So one of the faculty working, Du Bois has also written of this idea of double sights, was just kind of reciprocal, and that seemed to work a lot better for the piece as well. Okay. This is the last project I'm going to show with you. I don't want you guys to fall asleep, but this is me returning back to Charleston. This June, we opened the International African American Museum. When I say we, it's a building by Harry Cobb. Harry Cobb passed away a couple years right before COVID. It's probably one of the most prolific and most talented modern architects that America has produced. Joe Riley, the longest term mayor. I think Joe is over 40 years as a mayor, but this was his brainchild, something that he's been wanting to have in the Low Country. If you've never been to Charleston, Charleston's a very interesting place in that it's a swamp. It's just like DC. It's a swamp. It's a place where water, mud, and flux is there. But it's also a place where my ancestors, what we think of, close to 45% of the African slave diaspora landed here, moved inland, moved up north and south. This site has been lost. It's called Gadsden's Wharf. And for a lot of people, they think for African Americans, this is kind of the Plymouth. This is a place that you can return to. And prior to that, my experience of Charleston had primarily been through art projects at Spoleto. This was Spoleto. Me and a few other artists grew rice to show people that this was a swamp, and all you had to do was provide the plants, and the animals will come. This is at the Memminger Elementary School. We grew through 300 tubs of rice. And within a month, we had herrings, frogs, everything downtown. And at night, you could go in there, man. It was just like awesome sounds. But this idea of the Ancestors Garden comes out of the mission of the museum, right? To create a place for individuals, families, and groups to come and appreciate American history, particularly that of the contributions of African Americans to the Low Country. This is the neck. 2 rivers go up. Our site is over to the right. If you've been to Charleston, it's right next to the aquarium and the historic site. Before the museum went in, that's Gadsden's Park, that big beige thing. Where it says IAM, that was a public park. And then Mother Emanuel Church is 3 blocks away. This is where the young white North Carolinian comes down and massacred the congregation doing Bible studies. So this is all within a walking distance of one another. This is the old map, which was lost, which shows Gadsden's Wharf. It's one of the largest wharfs here. And you also see a little square set of rectangles. That was the warehouse. And the way the enslaved trade worked was once the Atlantic crossing, you'd be in pest houses at the mouth of the harbor at Sullivan's Island. They would then incubate the enslaved for I don't know how many days until they made sure you were healthy. Then they would bring slow boats in on the harbor, and then they pack them into these warehouses until it was time to sell them. And many perished here. There are stories of the food chain of the harbor. Sharks actually fed closer, but you can imagine the heat in Charleston and being stuffed in the small warehouse. The site, which every time I see this image, it blows my mind because there's someone walking their dog. But the site always felt that there was something weird about it. It was never quite developed. And right next to it, this kind of sandy area is where these large pipes go to a pump house. And during high waters, the pump house pumps all the water back out so the city doesn't flood. So it's a very precarious site through its infrastructure, but also through the memory. And so this is the building that Harry designed. It sits off the ground 13 feet because of hurricanes. That's a public building that the city owns, and so that's used for a lot of meetings. And the entire ground plane is open. And we chose the ground plane to kind of create this pseudo kind of French parterred garden that 3-dimensionally becomes Africana. So in plan, we kind of take this kind of French garden parterre design, but in 3 dimension, creates these kind of bold, singular moves. We fought really hard so that there's no fences around. So just like you take the ghost tours throughout the rest of the city, you can actually come to this site and actually enjoy it in the evening time as well. At the center of the project is trying to tell this story, right, of this voyage that takes place in the hull of a boat. But we're in this maritime sort of themed landscape. On Sullivan's Island, there's a meager display that actually had a duplication of that map. And I took a picture of this because when I first saw it, it looks like textiles, but then I started looking a little closer. It's actually the Brooks map. It's actually this map, but it's just done cheaply. So we started thinking about how could we actually take these figures and actually produce them at scale. And so this is us working with different material, then thinking about how to bring the water up off of the harbor onto our site to create this kind of infinity horizon. And then as you will be looking out, could we actually begin to play with perception? You're looking east. And when this thing drained, could you actually have the hole actually be there? And when it filled up, it disappeared. So this is the museum when it opened. We kind of created this primary dune landscape. This was what most edges would have had. You would have come through a dune and then out into a grassland. And we wanted to create this episode so that when you look back towards the city, that kind of viewpoint would be disrupted and that your eyes would literally go down. You would look down at the ground and at these grasses. And the ground is made of tabby, which is a concrete with crushed shells, oyster shells, and shells that we found in the Atlantic Ocean. So the entire ground is almost like the ocean floor. And then to one side, we literally have this ethnobotanic garden where we actually tried to put in as many plants as we know that were brought over during the voyage, where many women would put seeds in their hair. You know, some people actually digested seeds. And so there was a way to bring that native land here to America. And then we take you through this kind of experience through this very small ethnobotanic garden, but it's separated from the building. And then you find yourself in this place of steles where we know rocks have this power and there's sound that begins to talk about the different languages of different people that were enslaved. And then as you make your way to the edge, the water pools up and you can kind of see these figures that are somewhat obscured by the water. And then when the light hits, comes raking in, you see all the bodies that get literally exhumed from that edge. And then as the water fades away, it becomes completely different. And the puddles actually create this moment. And again, this idea of this tapestry in 2 dimensions, we wanted to sort of talk about all of those contributions. And we know that Africans really contributed to the building of Charleston. And some of the buildings you can actually find fingerprints on bricks from kids. And so we found this wonderful family of masons that actually did brickwork, and we did these beautiful crenellated curved walls, which are contributed to the masons. And then where the warehouse is located, we have a small piece of land on one side. We use Maya Angelou's quote to talk about we rose and we became at this moment. And as you move around, you just come upon different things. Charleston was one of the few cities where you could actually rent out for slaves. So you had to wear a badge, right? And you wore a badge. It had a number and it said what you did. And so the director wanted something that they could literally tell people and talk about this. So we made these screens that began to have this layer. But as you move through the garden, it's many things and the juxtaposition of things. And one of the conversations we had, the director and myself and some of the historians, is could we create a place where you could cry and laugh at the same time? Right? Because this is very much part of the African-American experience, where there's joy and sorrow live side by side. Right? And that might be a way, again, that we can begin to think about constructing these new landscapes where we can exhume the history, right? And talk about the contributions of people who've completely been erased, but we can feel. And we can actually tell these stories in places that we can begin to celebrate, but places where we can also talk about becoming, right? Because I think that's at the middle, one would think, of this American story. that everyone comes here and we become Americans, right? We're not Americans over there. We actually become Americans here. And the more we can be inclusive in that story, I think the richer our environments can be. And we could have more powerful conversations about us, we versus I. Thank you, guys. I don't know what protocol is.
Wow. That was incredible. I'm so inspired and honored to be here.
I'll come over here.
Thank you. I'm so honored and inspired to have this opportunity to work with you, and I'm so thrilled that you all at Hood Design Studios have chosen to take on Piedmont and this important project that we've put together. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be amazing. Yeah. I want to thank Walter Hood and Hood Design Studios, and of course all of you for coming out tonight to join us. We look forward to presenting design alternatives to the community in the coming months, and hope that you'll continue to engage with us and be a part of the process as we bring the Deering Family Memorial to life for you all. Thank you. We're hosting a brief reception to follow outside the theater doors, and we hope you'll stay and join us for that.